Okay. My phone says 11:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Kim Malm. I'm the Chief of Operations at CalPers. And joining me today is Janell, which is the Assistant Chief of Operations at CalPers, our Deputy General Counsel, Gina, Ratto, Renee, Ostrander, who's the Chief of Retirement Account Services, but at the time of this project was the IT Admin Chief, and Jessica Heinz, who is a Contract Analyst in the Contract section of CalPers. We thank you for coming and watching us this morning. We're hoping to have a riveting conversation about contracts and solicitations. In line with government transformation, CalPers went a process a couple of years ago to transform our contracting process. This was our third attempt at doing this, and this time, however, we found success. We currently do approximately 200 contracts a year, or about $375 million, in addition to about 2,500 procurements. This time around, what we ended up doing, and the reason we feel that it was a success, is we did what's called a Rapid Results Project. And we took 50 people across the organization, from IT, from investments, from legal, from audits, from security, and contracts, and we all went off-site. And we spent 2.5 days coming up with recommendations on how we could streamline the contracting process and make it easier. In addition to having this just a staff-based project, we also had a strong executive sponsorship. So we had the Deputy over Operations and Technology, or my boss, the General Counsel, which was Gina's boss, and the Chief Investment Officer. And that was key in having that executive sponsorship. It was not a project where a vendor came in and just wrote something for us and then we were expected to implement. There was a lot of skin in the game by the staff. We were told by the executives to think outside the box, not just do things the way we've always done them, and sometimes that can be tough, change is tough. But when you have all of the areas of your organization together and coming up with change, you get a lot more buy-in, and that's what we found to be true. What we ended up doing was the executive sponsors gave us full and complete approval to do what was necessary. So we set up some goals. We wrote a charter and we selected 4 teams. Those teams were going to tackle reduced complexity and use standardized processes, revamp the delegation of authority, create an IT solution, and educate users. So during those 2.5 days off-site, these 4 teams had to come up with their recommendations, knowing that they only got 100 days to implement the recommendations that came out. So this wasn't going to be a year-long project. They had 100 days. All of the recommendations were developed with the 2 main goals in mind: to reduce the time for solicitations from 162 days down to 81, and to reduce the amount of time for contracts from 100 days down to 50. So basically a 50% reduction. How did we do? So at the end of this project, what we have found is that we were able to reduce the contract time down to 51 days, so we missed it by a day, and the solicitation time down to 87 days. And this includes all of the contract negotiations, not just the completion of the contract. So let's start with Team 1, which was Reduced Complexity, led by Janell. This team established a small team approach for contracts and RFPs. The goals were to reduce the cycle time for RFPs and contracts, get the decision makers in the room so that there was less back and forth, ensure accountability and ownership in the final product, establish a standardized process for determining the appropriate type of procurement. So most of the time, you don't really know which type of solicitation to go through. So this was a Visio that helped our clients determine what type of contracting vehicle to be used. And then also, sorry, my phone. And also established an executive monthly dashboard that had green, yellow, red, letting the executives know what the status of their contracts and their RFPs were, which was very powerful. Team number 2, which was led by Gina Ratto, was responsible for delegation of authority and accountability. Their goals were to delegate contract signature authority to the deputies of the executive staff, with sub-delegation to the division chiefs up to $1 million. This would decrease the time to execute contracts and drove authority and accountability for decision-making downward throughout the organization. They also made the board resolutions consistent so that all contracts could have a permitted 5-year term. They streamlined the contract review process by eliminating legal office review on certain low-risk contracts, and obtained general counsel subdelegation to subordinates in the legal office of authority to approve deviations from the contract template. Team 3, which was led by Renee Ostrander, was the implementation of an IT tool. So they procured and implemented the PeopleSoft contracting module that allowed for version control, electronic workflow for routing and tracking of contracts. This also allowed for online collaboration. An automated approval cycle was also there, so we didn't have to route around the file folders anymore. A centralized repository of contracts, full version control and audit history, and most importantly, PeopleSoft contracts are now tied with PeopleSoft financials. So now we're able to not only not duplicate our efforts and type it into 2 different systems, but we're also able to make sure that there's funding available for those contracts. Last but not least, Team 4's leader is no longer with CalPers, but Jessica Heinz did the yeoman's share of the work on this team, and so she's here with us today. And this was the educating users aspect of the project. This was to create a consistent, current, and accurate contracting education program to ensure users are properly informed and equipped to do their job. They designed online training and certification for the executives and division chiefs so that they understood their roles on signing these contracts. They designed Contracts 101 for contract managers, created tutorials for various aspects of the contracting process, and updated the CMS, or our internal website, with all of the tools that is necessary in order to complete the solicitations and the contracts. They developed a web-based tutorial for the contract request form, and last but not least, actually most importantly, they developed the COPE system, which is a way for them to communicate with all the contract managers in the department to send them updates as to any of the tools updates or processes updates that we have. After this, after we finished those 2.5 days, we went back in front of the executives and presented to them all of our recommendations. We got a thumbs up or thumbs down from each one of the recommendations, and then we're told to go forth and multiply. We had 100 whole days to implement all of the things that we wanted to implement. After that 100-day implementation, one of the things that we had wanted to tackle, but we knew that we would not accomplish in the 100 days, was terms and conditions. I'm sure all of you have the same problems that we do with terms and conditions, and there's a few T's and C's that the vendor community struggle with, and you're negotiating on each and every single contract. And so we had 3 of those. Unlimited liability was one, indemnification was another, and conflict of interest. And so what we did is we sat down with our legal office and our audit office, and we developed what's called a Risk Worksheet. That worksheet asks a series of 12 very specific questions regarding the type of solicitation or contract that you're entering into. It asks questions like cost, sensitive data. As you can imagine, CalPers has some sensitive data, confidential data, and other items on like the complexity. Each of those questions are weighted differently based upon the risk of each one of those items. Once you have added up your score, it will determine whether your contract is a low-risk contract, a medium-risk contract, or a high-risk contract. So for a low-risk contract that got that score, you automatically would get to use 2 times the liability instead of having to negotiate with legal on unlimited liability. If it was rated as a medium contract, then we would automatically be able to use 4 times liability versus unlimited liability without having to go to legal. And then if it was a high-risk contract, it would still get unlimited liability. We made a change also in the indemnification section. And so if you were a low or medium-risk contract, we added the word gross negligence to that area. If you're a high-risk contract, it just stayed the word negligence. So what was important about this was that we were able to pre-negotiate this language and not just negotiate for no reason, but it was based on risk. And so that was really important and was able to resonate with the department because it wasn't just a willy-nilly negotiation. We actually had risk-based discussions on this. And so we utilize this for every single solicitation and contract at this time. Those forms are signed by the program area division chief, And division chief for us is a CEA level. And it's also then signed by the contracts administrator in OSSD and by the legal office. So you don't just get to self-certify. Next, let's talk a minute about cost and schedule. As I mentioned at the beginning, we had 100 days to implement the recommendations of this project. It then took us about a year after that to implement the risk assessment worksheet. Additional time was also required for full implementation of the PeopleSoft contracts tool, and Renee will talk to us in a few minutes about that implementation. Most of the cost was the 50-plus staff members that participated on this team. And then we also had about $500,000 in IT implementation costs for getting the software and hosting the software. Now I'd like to turn and ask the panel members some questions about the project. I'll go ahead and get them warmed up, and then I'll see if you guys have any questions after I ask a few. Let's get to the questions. So Janell, what was the most beneficial outcome of reduced complexity in the team development?
Hello? Okay. I have to say probably the most beneficial from my team was developing the small team concept that we call it. There are many layers of people who have input when a solicitation needs to be released, and so program first comes to you and they need it, they have a date of when they need it out. Program are the subject matter experts, but we have legal and my contract staff and if there's an IT component. So there's many people that need to be all on board when you're getting a solicitation out. So we created this small team concept, and depending on the complexity of your solicitation, you may only need a couple meetings. You could need, maybe 6 meetings if it's like a health solicitation or something very complex. But what it was we would have time at our desk to look at edits, make our changes, but when we would come to those small teams, we would look at the document in real time. We'd have it up on the screen. We'd be making changes with everyone in the room. So there'd be dialogue, legal would be there, programs there, you're all talking, it's all in one room, and you're making the changes in real time. And then we would have a drop dead date. So our last small team meeting would be that this is it, we're all going to come here, we're going to be making these edits in real time, and then one more chance for review. So it really streamlined our process and kept from sometimes at the last minute, it would finally get up to, a chief level, and they would want changes, and we wouldn't be able to make our date. So, and it was very empowering. So the people who came to, those were decision makers who were in the small team. So you needed to have people in that meeting who were able to make those decisions about your solicitation. And I believe it was very powerful, and we've been able to streamline the process significantly by using this.
So you have a lot of early adopters, did you, on starting the small teams?
Of course. So, change is hard for people, and, kind of the same old, this is how we've always done it, is a lot of pushback that we got. But I would say, too, having that executive sponsorship like we had, like having Deputy General Counsel, to say, this is how we're going to do it, was powerful. So to be able to push back, on some of the program areas and say, can't make change, we're not going to be able to meet your date if now we have to go back and redo this. And so, it was very powerful, and you really need that sponsorship at the highest levels in the organization to make it successful.
So Gina, on the delegation of authority and accountability, what was the critical reason for changing the signatory delegation of contracts?
Well, before we started on this project, there were only 2 people in the entire organization that were authorized to sign contracts, the final execution of contracts on behalf of CalPers in order to bind CalPers legally to the contract. So with over 200 contracts per year, as you can imagine, that created a bottleneck. The 2 people that were the signers, weren't people that didn't have day jobs and didn't have something else to do. So, it was really kind of unreasonable to expect that these 2 people would be signing all of the contracts that CalPers was entering into. And then there was also the question of whether or not they were the right people to be executing contracts on behalf of CalPers, because For the most part, they would not have known anything about this contract until it landed on their desk. They weren't involved in the decision to let the contract. They weren't involved in the design of the contract, in the negotiation of the terms and conditions. So there was a real question what value they were adding to the process, and it was just really seemed like a rubber stamp at that point. So by delegating signing authority down to the division chiefs, and as Kim mentioned, that's the third level of the organization. So pushing down the responsibility and accountability for signing that contract put the responsibility in the program area, the true owner of the contract. And these were the people that either already knew about the contract, had been involved in the development of the contract, or if they hadn't been, they really needed to be. So it was a way to really make those division chiefs own up to the contract. And there's something, I think, maybe cathartic about signing on behalf of CalPers and committing the organization to these contracts. And it also made the process much more timely.
Okay. Renee, how now, brown cow, did you implement an IT solution in 100 days?
I know it seems impossible, but I'm here to say that we did do it and it can happen. There was really three components to the success of us being able to do it. And the first one you've heard multiple times, and it's that executive sponsorship. So, and their support once we left that room after 2.5 days, they gave us the authority to do what we needed to do. And so that really drove us in terms of support as we moved out to perform the job that we needed to do to bring this in-house. And the second one was that driving unified commitment. So we were all driven by the same goal. We had, so in my particular group, we had contract staff that were going to be using this system on a daily basis. We had the IT people who were going to be supporting it, and then we had program, and they were all in a room together, and they were having those user requirements discussions. They were having a lot of talks about what did we need, how is it going to work. I mean, not just theoretical, but really getting into the practical sense of, can that work for us? Can we modify our processes? Can we streamline things? And then will this work for us? The third piece to it was we decided to utilize a demo or test environment for our first 90 days or 100 days that we did this. Excuse me. We utilized a hosted solution, and we used it out of the box. So we didn't go into any customizations right from the outset. We utilized this out-of-the-box solution. We were able to load everything in that we needed to load in, and we were able to move the work through. But what it did for us by utilizing this as a first step, as a type of proof of concept, allowed us to see how it actually worked, how the users used it, how it interacted with our organization. So then we could see what types of customizations, if any, that we wanted to make in our long-term solution. And it took us about a year, but we did ultimately implement the long-term solution in-house, utilizing, broadening it out instead of just being in that demo or test type environment.
So the PeopleSoft Contracts is the product that we implemented. Prior to that, we used Excel spreadsheets and pieces of paper to track our contracts. And so what this allowed us to do was put all of our contracts into one repository. We got monthly requests from the board, from our board, on how many contracts you have and what are active, and we just simply couldn't give them that information without spending a number of weeks. So this allowed us to put all of our contracts into this database, and that's at least what we were able to do with our first round, and we were able to produce a report for the board members on the contracts that were in there. And now, as Renee was talking, we were able to use it for so much more. So now we are able to do on online collaboration. We're now able to do it for routing instead of routing around those special blue folders that you all might see for signature and initials.
Yeah, it was. It was really, I mean, I want to add on to that. It was really great in terms of we had staff then spending time analyzing the data that was in the system rather than spending the time trying to reconcile data. You know, we always try to get away from those non-value added steps. And where we were prior to that, Kim talks about Excel, spreadsheets, and pieces of paper. You can only imagine when you get a request from your board saying, well, what about this? How much do we do here? How much do we spend on this? And to have to look through Excel spreadsheets or look through stacks of real paper to try and add. You know, you want instead to be able to spend that time evaluating and start doing trending, start to ask bigger questions of the data that you have. And so that for us was big, no longer having the manual entry problems, having to reconcile. So that was just huge.
Okay. Jesse, what was the most significant benefit to the process and staff of the training and education piece of this project?
I would say providing the tools and training that were necessary for staff to be able to get their jobs done efficiently. Our group had a very large task because education touched all pieces of this contract reform project. Our goal to develop educated users was really a three-part process. We first had to look at what we currently had available to staff and determine what we could improve in those areas. So we began looking at our internal website and found that we had a lot of very useful information out there, but it didn't necessarily tell somebody how to complete a particular task. So for example, we had full definitions and descriptions of all of our contracting vehicles available for staff to use, but nowhere did we tell them how to determine which one was the best one to use for the types of products that they were trying to procure. So as a solution to that, we developed a decision tree that essentially walks somebody through identifying the services that they need and determining the parameters for that particular contract, cost, for example, and then ultimately being able to determine the appropriate contract vehicle to procure those services. This kind of the second task that we had to take on was training for staff. We had so many changes coming from this contracts reform process or project that we needed to provide training to everybody. We had a lot of requests prior to the project for a sort of an introductory to CalPers contracting and procurement process. And so we developed a sort of contracts and procurement one-on-one, which gave an overview of the process. And that class, since that date, that class has been so popular that we literally, the day that we post it available, it fills up and we have 30 people on the waiting list trying to get in. So for that, we're actually excited for coming up this year. We're going to change that class into a web-based training course so that anybody can take it at any time. We also needed to provide training for the contract managers and staff who would have delegation of authority to sign contracts. After this process or this reform project, many of those people were finding themselves in a new role. And so we wanted to provide detailed training for them so that they knew their roles and responsibilities and what was expected of them. And that was also developed for each of those roles. We developed the training in a web-based format. And our reason for going that route was that it helped us to accommodate the coming and going of staff, as well as being able to track who had taken the training and if they were in compliance with the mandatory certification that we had set up for those roles. And then the last training piece that we had to develop was for the PeopleSoft system. that we were implementing. It was a brand new system for all of CalPers staff, and lots of steps involved in using the system. So we created step-by-step procedural manuals that staff could have at their desks to reference at any time that they needed to. And then we also did group training sessions to help walk people through the system and get them comfortable with using the system once we went live with the program. And then last, which I think is probably the most important, and Kim had touched on it, was our e-bulletin system that we call COPE, which stands for Contracting and Procurement e-bulletins. And we created that system because we needed a way to communicate with staff across the enterprise, not only for all of the upcoming changes that were coming up from our project, but also moving forward, just as a way to send out updates to people on new contracting processes, a new policy, perhaps new legislation coming down the road that was going to affect the way we process contracts and procurement.
Thank you. I have a lightning round of a couple of questions, and then we'll ask the audience if they have any. Janell, what benefits did you realize with the monthly status report that went to the executives and division chiefs?
So we put together basically like a monthly dashboard was also something else that came out of my group. And many of you have probably seen something like this where you sort of put your projects on there, green, yellow, red, status. We did that with all of the solicitations. And it was a good tool too because it got to the executive level and to the management level. And they could see everything going on. You know, that just their piece of it wasn't the only thing that CalPers was working on. And so they could see everything that was going on. They could see all the due dates. They could see status. They could see, there was a comments area. And so it became a powerful tool when a program area wasn't going to meet their deadline. So, of course, I would never put anyone in yellow or red without a warning call. But I would let them know that we were having a problem meeting, their deadline, and this is getting ready to go out. And 9 times out of 10, they would either meet their deadline or they would give me a new release date. So that, yes, it proved to be a very powerful tool, and we're still using it, and it goes out monthly.
Gina, what was the reasoning behind extending the contracts to 5 years?
So prior to this project, it was CalPers' contracting policy that all contracts would have a term of an initial 3 years with 2 one-year optional renewals. And after this, we went to a standard out of the gate would be a maximum term of 5 years. What we had found before we extended the term of the contract was pretty much that all contracts that went the 3 years would then go the additional 2 years on top of it. So when we got into the situation where we were amending the contract to add time, as soon as we finished that first amendment and extension of time, it seemed like it was time to start working on the second extension of time. So we had created a lot of work for ourselves that again was not adding value and CalPers wasn't receiving much of any benefit from that. I think part of what was really important and critical to this decision was the fact that we have a very strong termination provision in the contract. So we were already able to terminate the contract on short notice if there was poor performance or no cause termination. So we weren't taking on very much risk, if any, by starting out with a 5-year contract term, and we were really saving a lot of extra work that was not value add type work. And by doing this, we were able to refocus the energies of those people on more important tasks.
So Renee, what hard lesson did you learn trying to implement an IT product in 100 days?
And there are always lessons to learn in that space. I think the biggest thing for us is that we had to take our capes off and not act like superheroes. So for some reason, we thought, we're just going to go ahead, we're going to do the whole thing. You know, initially out of the gate, it was, let's implement a full system, let's do the whole thing. And, you know, after a few weeks and realization hit, we realized that it was not realistic. And no matter how much we wanted to do it, that was just a bit too much to chew on. And so for us, it would have been better to recognize that earlier on. And we still were able to do what we wanted to do in that amount of time, but it would have been an easier run had we just started with a little bit smaller goal. So
Hence the hosted offsite.
recognize
solution.
your constraints early on, definitely.
Jesse, I was going to ask you about COPE, but I think you covered that pretty well. So I'm going to turn it to the audience and see if you guys have any questions. Yes?
Do you feel that you got a break on the costs for the contracts as a result of the 5-year term? Do you think the contractors gave you a more competitive price? Did that even weigh into your thinking?
It did weigh into our thinking that we might get a better price knowing that the vendor now has a 5-year term. I'm not certain if we actually realized or captured what we had done previously with 3 + 1 + 1 and then with the 5-year. It also made our lives just as easy. You know, there's something to be said about it's not just always, you know, what's beneficial for the state. You know, we have vendor partnerships, and so trying to make whatever is easy for all of us together.
Thank you.
So-
Are you guys under DGS control to start?
No, sir. However, no, sir. However, we do follow all of the. Do you want to answer?
I was gonna say, maybe
Yeah.
Gina should
Okay,
have
Gina, go ahead.
the lawyer in the room.
So, no, we do not submit our contracts to DGS, but we do follow the Public Contracts Code and the SAM manual and all of the normal DGS requirements.
The 3-year contract, that's an ongoing issue with us. And, you know, the addition to 5 years. Most of our contracts are given exemptions to up to 5 years. The DGS basically controls us, doesn't allow us to issue as a standard practice 5-year contracts automatically. And also the idea of doing even 2-year extensions instead of 2 1-year extensions would seem to make a lot of sense.
So one of the reasons we're here today is we're hoping that with government transformation, that we can all learn from one another, right? And so that maybe some of the things that we were able to do that we can, you know, help everyone else take a look at. That risk worksheet is one of those really important things, right? Instead of just going and negotiating with DGS on terms, having a document that actually rates the risk and then that gives you some leverage when you have those conversations, I think is important. But a lot of the things we talked about today, you can do internally, like the small team approach, you can do internally. Educating your staff, you can do internally. Communicating with your staff on how to use these forms, you can do internally.
As far as I'm aware, there's no provision in state law in the Public Contracts Code that limits the term to 3 years. So I think that is DGS policy. DGS
More,
policy.
They have a
procedural.
provision that if you go beyond 2, you have to justify it, but yeah, it's more of a, sounds like more of a policy implementation than
And I would venture to guess that that's been their policy for many, many years, and maybe they need to rethink it.
Well, and that's why we're all here today, right? Including DGS. DGS is here also. I think that, you know, we're all a team and we can all learn from each other and we're all looking at transformation.
So congratulations on all the changes that you guys have made. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Should have nominated yourself for an award.
There's more writing.
I'm probably not the only one in the audience that's a little bit jealous of your authority to do certain things, you know, where we go and try and do things like changing the indemnification clauses in our general provisions. It's very difficult for us to do that because we have to have statutory authority. So there's that extra layer for us, but I'm very glad that you guys have it. My question really revolves around the efficiencies that you guys saw Was it just internal, or did this also help your vendor community understand or do things better or faster? Or did you guys take into account what might work better or not work better for them?
You know, the things that we implemented did not necessarily affect the vendor community, except for the fact that we already negotiated the terms and conditions for them. But as far as the utilizing the PeopleSoft contracting software, they are not part of the PeopleSoft contracting software, so they don't get to like approve online. We still send them a hard copy. They still sign a wet signature, and it still comes back to CalPers. We still have to keep a hard copy with a wet signature on property. So that part didn't help them out. But as far as negotiating the terms and conditions, so that they didn't have to come in and say, I'm doing a speaking engagement for you, and I have an unlimited liability, can we talk about this? And we'd have to do that for 200 contracts and amendments and potentially 2,500 purchase orders. So that helped, at least that way, for the vendor community. Thank you. Yes?
I just have a question about your staffing levels. How many contract officers do you have to handle those 200 contracts and 2,500 procurement?
30.
officers.
Oh. Well, we have
Management
about
level?
30 contract analysts, and then we have 3 SSM1s, 1, 2, and 1, 3. Thank you.
Are you using the same methodology for cloud as you move into cloud procurements, or is that already built into your procurement?
So we are starting to utilize the cloud, and we have language that we have developed with IT and with the legal office that we put into our contracts and our RFPs as far as what items go into the cloud and the protections that we require. But we're not storing our templates and our documents at this time in the cloud, Vicki.
Are you adhering to cloud first policy?
IT, where's IT? I don't know. I didn't invite them.
Chris is laughing.
Were there any resistance on the 5-year term from the vendor community, or did you allow it as graduating or escalating scale?
We've found no resistance from the vendor community. They didn't like negotiating with us 3 times per contract any more than we like negotiating with them. So they were happy to have a 1 5-year term contract. Yes, sir.
What software are you using to develop a dashboard? And I would love to see a copy before I
A copy of what? Oh, the risk assessment?
risk assessment and what software are you using for the dashboard?
Okay. That was
Oh, it's just a Word document.
with little yellow.
Happy to share a sample. Yellow, green, red. Yeah, just something that we put together, and I send it, or I was in my when I had this role 3 years ago. I would send it out like by the 10th of every month.
So we have on the next page a email address that you can send a note to. I also have business cards here today. If you'd like a copy of that risk dashboard, I'm happy to share it with
And the
you.
handouts, Kim, and the handouts.
Oh, yeah, and also our PowerPoint is up here in the front if you want to grab a copy of it before you leave. Yes, ma'am.
I'm also wondering if I could, just sounds like I could maybe get a copy of your 101 advice.
The Contracts 101? Sure.
Yeah, is that possible?
Yes.
Yeah, send your request to that email address, and we'll be happy to send that out.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yeah.
How did you select PeopleSoft? Did you have to go through any kind of a procurement for that process and select, and how did you select PeopleSoft as your
PeopleSoft is, we already had PeopleSoft Financials. And so it was already a product that we had in-house that we were moving forward on. And anytime we could utilize that product line, we were doing so because that's our staff were being trained on all of that. And we wanted it to tie into PeopleSoft Financials. Yes, sir? Either one.
You mentioned that you've taken a close look at your procurement and contracting system 3 times in the last 10 years. Can you say a few words about that and why you made it a priority? Is it from feedback you're getting from program folks? Is it dissatisfaction by contract specialists with the cumbersome process?
Well, I would say that the reason we went back and tried to do this a third time was just like the rest of you, customer base constantly complaining how long it took. And they don't just complain to us, right? It bubbles up to the board. And so then the board is asking, why does it take so long? Then they also have RFPs. Why does it take so long? Why is it taking almost a year to do an RFP? It seems crazy. And so that was the reason why. We also know there's pain points for the vendor community. But this was really just to try and reduce the process and the time frame of the process.
I would also say that in the past times where we had done this, the change was more incremental, and sometimes it went backwards. And in this time around, it was really more transformational. It was having that broad support. It was having everybody engaged. I mean, to have 50 people off-site for 2.5 days doing nothing but focusing on how to make it better. It's just not something that you do every day, and everybody was fully committed to that, and that was the difference to truly make it something that was remarkable.
Well,
in the
and
change.
the first 2 times we hired an external consultant to come in and spend a whole bunch of time telling us what we already knew. And then, they don't have any skin in the game. So, then they pack up and they go home. So, the 2 prior attempts were really, I think, unsuccessful.
They were more written documents, like a plan on what we should do, not, it really meant a lot to have 50 people across the organization part of this. I mean, and make no mistake, we chose the people that are never happy, right? We chose the people that always complain, because if we could get them on our side, then we could get the rest of the organization on our side. You had a question still?
Yeah, 2 related questions. When you talked about moving the authority to sign for these contracts out, is there a dollar limitation that you have as to what authority the branch chief has to sign for? That's the first question. And then a related question is, do you think you've lost something in having those people sign where it may not filter up as to some of the things that you're doing in the department to the higher ups? And then suddenly go, whoa, where did this come from?
So the authority is limited to the division chiefs. It's $1 million is the maximum contract amount that they can ink the deal for. I don't think that we've lost anything through the process because, I'm the equivalent of a division chief, and if I don't keep my boss informed, I've got more problems than just having signed a contract, right? So, I mean, there are other reasons why there needs to be communication between the division chief and the deputy executive officer to whom he or she reports. So in my experience, I don't believe we've lost anything, and I think we've really added accountability.
Anything over $1 million then goes to the deputy level, which is who reports directly to the CEO. And it actually states in the process that they're responsible to report any of those contracts that they sign that's over $1 million to the CEO. So it's part of like their one-on-one conversations.
I would also add to that don't forget there's the monthly report that Janell was doing that goes out to all the executives to say everything that's on the plate. So they're already not just the second level of the organization knowing about it, being that boss, but the entire second level of the organization is aware of it before it ever gets to the end result of a third level signing. So there's a lot of communication and awareness and openness in what is being worked on by the organization.
I believe we're out of time. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and taking time out of your day. Again, thank you.